So, Sheila, we've been working together
Yeah.
for 10 years at Stillwaters.
Yeah.
Lots of different clients, lots of stories.
Yeah.
But I've never really asked, how did you get into it? How did you come to be at Stillwaters?
Yeah.
Because you're not from the UK, are you?
I'm not. We were newly arrived in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And I had worked in a similar ministry when we were living in Texas. And the Lord just really laid it on my heart when we arrived that, well, maybe it's time to get back into this work again. And so I just pretty much Googled pregnancy centers in Birmingham, and it came up with Stillwaters. And so I just rang up and went and checked it out and really felt like this was a place that I wanted to minister and wanted to serve. And so it was really good because the thing that I like is just the number of people that we are able to reach out to, that we're really able to help through, especially their losses, to be able to be there and to hear their story and to help them through that. So, Sam, what about you? How did you get involved with Stillwaters?
I was having a break from teaching. I wanted to do something different, and I met a woman, Lee, who volunteered at Stillwaters, and she said that they need more volunteers, and I was interested, so because it was local to me as well, and I rang up and John Smith, the manager at the time, but nobody got back to me, and so I thought I'll just go out, and I felt God say walk past there, and I didn't want to, but I felt like I was pushed to walk past there, and then I thought if the door's open, I'll go in, and the door was open, so I thought I'll just try it. Yeah. So I rang the doorbell, and a woman answered the door, and she said, "Sam," and I went, "Yes, but I haven't made an appointment."
Yeah.
And she goes, "Sam, we've been expecting you." And I said, "Yes, but I haven't made an appointment." And she goes, "Come upstairs." And so I went upstairs, and they were waiting for a Sam, a client's friend who never arrived. But I turned up at the time that they were waiting for that Sam instead. So we all had a laugh. And then I joined the team, and I started off doing pregnancy crisis and moved on to doing post-abortion clients. So I've been doing that for over 10 years now.
Yeah. What a great story. I'm glad you went upstairs. Yeah, it's been great. So just thinking about those 10 years and different clients that you've been able to work with, what do you think is like a common theme that you've seen through all of them?
It's great to journey with them, but these clients come to us so broken, and some of them know why, and some of them don't know why. And when they begin to tell their stories, even though they'd made the decision to have the abortion, some are very confused afterwards, because they think that if they have the abortion, life would get back to normal.
Almost like a reset button, they think, isn't it?
Yeah, life will get back to normal, and I'll just get rid of this problem. Yeah. And but what really happens is they're never the same again. And so the clients that we have seen, they think they'll be fine, and then they start to have feelings of grief, which looks like, they're becoming more tired, they're crying and they don't know why, they're having thoughts about the baby and about the abortion. They might have some hallucinations or hear voices. And so when these clients come, they're all in a troubled way. And what's amazing is when we walk through the different stages of grief, when we walk through the step-by-step program, when we look at telling the story, because we might be the first person they tell the story to, which is very difficult. And then they go through the anger stage, and the shame, and then the blame, and then the accountability, and then the grief. When we look at the grief, that's always quite commonly a massive turning point in the therapy that we do, because it's acknowledging the loss, and they find out why that it is grief that they're feeling, and then they find out why, and then they are having to deal with that. So, and then after that, they come through into moving on into the future. So with all of the clients, it's been a privilege really to journey with them, but also to see them come through the grief, which we say will always come up. There'll always possibly be reminders on anniversaries, but the grief might not be as painful as it first was, as they came to us in the first place. Did you find that?
No, that's very true. That's very true. And I think a lot of them, the clients, they don't recognize that they're in that grief, like you were talking about. So they might just think it's just sadness, or they might just think, okay, I just can't quite get on with life, but they don't recognize it as grief. Because I think a lot of times they don't feel like that they're allowed to grieve.
That's true.
So maybe we should just talk about what grief is. Maybe just a working definition of grief.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I would say that grief is a response to a loss. And grief comes in all kinds of ways, because we can grieve for a lost job. Mainly it's about a loss of someone, isn't it? That's what we really associate grief with, a death of a person. But it could also be a loss of a job, or a loss of an experience, or a loss of a physical, not being able to do something that you're used to doing. But with abortion, we normally use the term disenfranchised grief, because society says that you shouldn't grieve because you made that decision. And so often our clients feel like they don't have a right to grieve. And it's not, with normal, different cultures do it in different ways. If we, in Asian culture, if someone dies, people come round and they visit, and we don't really send cards, but but people sit with that person. They sit with them in their grief. In an abortion situation, you have none of that, and there might be no one that this client has told the story to. And I've had clients that I'm the first person they've told the story to. And so in that sense, the grief is not acknowledged. And so they don't think they have permission to grieve. And we've had clients that have come after 1 year, after 5 years, after 30 years, remember? And until it was acknowledged and brought into the light, really, to deal with and to make peace with, it doesn't mean that they're going to forget, but that sting of that first grief is not there. But it's difficult. It's a very difficult kind of grief, because it's so hidden, it's so taboo, and people think that you should have got over it by now.
No, that's true.
You made that decision. You should have got over it by now.
Or sometimes clients wonder why they haven't gotten over it by now. They think, it's been so long ago, I should have just been able to move on.
And they feel like the loss of control, isn't there? Why am I still crying? Actually, why am I getting worse? Because they start off thinking they're okay, I've done it, I've done that, I've done the abortion, it's fine. But then they continue to grieve, and the grief gets worse. And so when I have the clients, I say that, this is a safe space. And from your symptoms, I can see that you're grieving. I'm saying here that I'm giving you permission to grieve, because this is a loss. And they don't realise that, because it's huge. That whole idea of permission to grieve, that opens up a whole new door for them, doesn't it? When they realize, I've experienced a loss. And it's just, I have lost something, so I need to grieve that. And I think it's through that, grieving that, then they can move past it. But not until they recognize it. Recognize their loss and what it's meant to them, can they move forward. So I think with that, it's just thinking through clients. It's like, okay, like you said, it doesn't matter if it's been 1 year or 30 years. It's them opening up, being able to tell us their story, which is such a privilege to be able to hear. But then it's like they're not carrying that alone anymore. I think that's the part, isn't it? Grief makes you feel so alone, doesn't it? And isolated. And because the thing is, say, I lost my father, but my sister, my brother, my mother were going through that with me. With an abortion, she might be with a partner, she might not. The partner might have forced her, or there's all kinds of stories. But she'll be, essentially alone in that. And so it's quite a powerful work. This work, and it's when the client has that breakthrough, because one of the big things that we do with grief is it not only acknowledging it, but acknowledging that this was a life, you know, and to give respect to that life by naming the baby.
So important.
Naming the baby, and always, mostly, the mother knows the sex of the baby.
She just has that feeling, doesn't she?
Yeah, and naming the baby, and then writing that letter to the baby of how you're feeling in this stage. There's always just a huge breakthrough if the clients have the courage to do that. They don't all have the courage to do that, and that's fine, because we go with the clients at their own pace and their own time. But you can see when I remember back, you can see in their eyes when they begin to realise, because half the confusion when they come to visit, like, what's going on? I'm out of control. Right. Why do I keep crying and stuff? So it's seeing that realisation that they see and they discover for themselves. So we're just kind of journeying, following this manual faithfully. But they're hopefully holding the safe space for them to discover the truth of where they're at and what's really happened, the mammoothness of what's really happened. We've never had a pregnancy crisis client come back to us and said, I regret having the baby.
No, that's true. That's true, yeah. And in thinking about, as we help the clients process the grief, I think it's important, the thing that we do that says that, you know, grief never goes away. It's not like one day they'll stop grieving. It just looks very different, doesn't it? As the longer it goes on. So I think it's the whole imagery, like when a loss first happens, it's almost like, you know, it's right in front of your face. You can't see anything else because that grief is all consuming. But once we walk through that process with them, or they work through that grief, acknowledge their loss, talk about the pain of it, then it's that grief is able to come from up here and it kind of moves down in their heart. So it's still there. It really becomes just that proper place in their heart. They don't forget, but they're able to accept it and to be able to move forward.
That's a beautiful way of putting it, because it is there, and then it might reoccur on anniversaries and on certain dates. Part of the program is we tell them to be mindful of those dates and not to plan too much, because grief, if it comes up, it's going to come up, and it can be all-consuming and overwhelming and heavy. But, you know, eventually, when it's all they see through the program, and eventually with life and with the skills that they've got, they can move it down and internalize it in a way so it's not all-consuming and pick up life again.
Right. Yeah. I think when a client is in so much grief, it's almost like they can't handle anything else. Like any other little stressor puts them over
it demands
the top.
attention. The grief demands attention.
But once they focus on that grief and work through it, then it's everything else in life is much less stressful for them, isn't it? And it's really difficult for them, because if they've got to function and they've got to go to work, and if they've got other kids and a family to look after, and then there's this huge darkness that they're carrying, this huge weight of grief, which is getting bigger and bigger and all-consuming. A lot of the clients that I've seen have had to have time off work, that they just can't function. They don't have the
They've gone so far that they're unable to function until they deal with this. And, whether it's with us or Rachel's Vineyard.
Right. It's important that they get that help, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's think about not only the clients, but let's think about maybe the partners. I know we've seen some men as clients as well. Any come to mind that you can think of that have dealing with their grief?
I did see a couple and once separately and occasionally together, and the father was in deep grief. Quite more in touch, I'd say, with his grief than his partner. But that was once he'd acknowledged it, and because it doesn't move in a linear way. I mean, we work through the program in a linear way, but they might be feeling the anger and the shame along with the grief, and then we'll touch on those chapters as we go through the program in a linear way. But once he was already in that grief period, so it was quite easy to do the letter writing.
Okay.
Once he'd acknowledged that, and I think it helps for them to know that someone knows that I understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
This is normal, you know. This is normal to feel like this after an abortion.
Yeah.
And you know, they moved on quite quickly. And sometimes I have clients who are still with their partners, and then they feed back to their partners after each session, and their partner sort of goes through it with them, especially with naming the baby and then writing the letter. That's always a really powerful thing to do, and then naming the child together. You know.
Yeah. I think about a male client that I had, and his grief came out as anger. So he just became a really angry person.
Oh, really?
And once he recognized, okay, that was really grief that he was dealing with. It's not just the anger. So it was grief that was under there. And once we started working through that grief and he was able to identify his feelings, to be able to name what those were, then he's like, oh, yeah, that's where that anger is coming from.
Yeah.
And so he was able just to work through that. And it's just amazing just to see how far he had come in that time by just recognizing his loss.
Yeah.
You know?
I think it's just bringing truth to people.
Yeah.
It's a truth of their situation. It's a truth that it's so easy to have an abortion, but people really don't know what happens afterwards. You know, some people are fine, or some people are in deep denial for years and years and years.
Yeah.
But actually, it's bigger than we think.
Yeah.
You know, because of the power of having a life inside of you, and then getting rid of that, and then being the person who did it with whatever circumstance.
Yeah.
It's a huge thing to recover from, and I think people, you know, need to know that grief does follow. You know, this huge decision, and there needs to be more education.
Right, there really does.
Yeah.
There really does. Yeah. And I think, like you said, some people are able to work through that grief.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes it's just there's a complicated grief that they just can't get through on their own.
Yeah.
So I think that's when it's important they reach out to somebody like us or Rachel's Vineyard, you know, just to be able to say, okay, I'm stuck. You know, I just need help.
Yeah.
But knowing that there is that help available.
Yeah.
That they can walk through that process of grief. And
Yeah.
knowing that they can come out on the other side.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. And it's like we look at it like a river of grief. You can't go around it. You can't go over it, but you have to walk through the river of grief.
Right.
And there's these stepping stones that we take them through with, you know, naming with their names of, you know, telling the story, the anger, the shame, the blame, the grief, the accountability, and letting go and moving on. Just to walk through this river. They have to walk through that river of grief to get to the other side, to be able to internalize that grief and to be able to function with it. They're never the same again after this experience.
That's exactly right. So we've talked about partners. What about grandparents? People who've lost the chance to be a grandparent by the daughter or the son having a termination.
Yeah, that's a good point. We did have a grandmother once who started, and because we don't realise how it affects the family tree, how it affects, it's not just the mother, the father, the siblings. And I had clients who've talked about siblings where the mother is able to help them with a memory box for that baby, and they go through it and they celebrate the birthday of the baby, because some of them might be twins as well. I've had some who've had the loss of a twin, and so it affects the whole family and the whole family tree, and so when grandparents find out, because they're not always told,
no, they're not.
They go through that grief process as well, and sisters as well, you know, sisters that who want to support their sister also, you know, it affects the whole family, really.
It does. Yeah. So since we've been doing this for so long, 10 years at Stillwaters, what client comes to mind? If you can think back on your clients, what's a client that just comes to mind that you've never forgotten, that you just really have seen how he or she has just really embraced the program and has just come through on the other side?
Oh, wow.
So many. I know it's hard to... Yeah. I think about this woman who had multiple abortions, and she just came and she was so lost. She just had no idea, and she didn't recognize what she was feeling. She was afraid to feel what she was feeling, actually. But just as we were walking through and just being able to, you know, we do the example of how, what are your feelings? Like to name your feelings, express your feelings.
Yes, yeah.
And so once we walked through that, she's like, okay, now I can see what I'm dealing with.
Yeah.
And once she was able to see that, then we were able to pick it apart and say, okay, this makes sense to her. This makes sense to her. And she was just able to then accept the decision that she made. And then she found such freedom at the end. So,
that's a beautiful, powerful story.
I always remember her. Yeah.
Yeah. And I finished a very young client who sometimes you don't realise, who found it, you don't realise what effect it's having, and they seem to come every week ready for the next step, who still is suffering with a grief, but it's minimalised, and it's not, I don't think it's quite internalised yet, but the grace of God is that he keeps this work going even when our 10 sessions are finished. But still, she made huge breakthroughs, and just going back into life again and appreciating the children around her and the gift of what this baby was, and also seeing the clients who have acknowledged how this baby has changed them.
True.
And helped them to have different boundaries, put proper boundaries in place, and to look at everything, really.
Yeah.
So even though this baby was in their life a short amount of time, I've seen clients who've said, actually, if I hadn't have had this baby, if I hadn't held this baby, carried this baby, I would not be in this place that I am now, and seeing life like this, putting these boundaries in place. I had an incredible client who's really, really suffering with grief and guilt, and as a way to get over it, she would busy herself.
Okay, yeah.
And she learned to stop, and then when she stopped, the grief came up, and she felt it. But it was a release for her. You know, it was a bit difficult and messy at first, but then as she released it, she released the stress in her tears. She gave herself time to grieve, because it does take time.
Yeah, it does.
And we're not all robots that we should just function, because apparently there's 3 days off you can have for work in my job for grief. Yeah. But it's a lifetime work. And she took time to grieve, and she just came through in a huge way, and was more of a rounded mother for her existing children, and just so life was brighter. That colour had come back, because a lot of them describe it as the colour's gone out of my life, and it's just drab and black and white. I used to be like this, but now I'm like this. And we do a gauge at the beginning. We say, out of 10, how do you feel? And it's always low, and then after they've done the grief work, and it improves, and they love seeing that.
Yeah. So one more question I want to ask you. If you were to give advice to somebody that's watching this that maybe has experienced a loss, a termination, an abortion, what hope would you want to give them? What would you want them to know?
That, whatever you've done, God is bigger than all of that, and God forgives you. But also, God doesn't want you to suffer in your grief. You've suffered enough. God does want to set you free, but also wants to help you to, acknowledge the grief of what's happened. So you cannot live in this death forever. And there's always hope.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And there are, people who specialise in working in this come to us, speak to us, and allow yourself to grieve. I'm saying you have permission to grieve, because it's a loss. It's a death.
It is.
It's alive, and then there's a loss. But give yourself time to grieve. Allow yourself to cry over it. acknowledge the baby, acknowledge the feelings that you had when the baby was growing inside your womb, acknowledge any warmth and any future hopes that you had for this baby, acknowledge that, grieve for that, and set time aside and anniversaries. And if the grief comes up, don't push it down, write it out in a journal, write your feelings out, write a letter to your baby, write a letter to anyone else involved. If there's anyone you're angry with, get that anger out, go to a place of forgiveness, perhaps the medical team, or just give yourself time to grieve, because this demands time. Respect.
And I would also want them to know they're not alone. They do not have to
really
walk through this
important.
alone. They can. There are people they can share their story with. People that can walk alongside this grief with them. There are people to help. They're not alone. Good.